Suzanne Hendrix, and she's from Pentara Corporation. So they provide data services to a lot of companies in terms of the healthcare and as well as pharma industry. So Suzanne, thank you very much for taking time. I know we spoke about a little bit about your background and what you do and how we do. For the sake of audience, I would appreciate if you could just unwind your journey. Why did you start this organization and what exactly you do to support the organization which are looking for your service?
I started out in clinical trials in the early 90s in the Boston area, and I learned a lot about how clinical trials are run across a lot of different disease areas. And in the early 2000s, I got a job at Myriad Pharmaceuticals, and they were developing a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And so over the next 6 years, I worked in the Alzheimer's space, and in 2008, their compound failed. And at that point, I wanted to use what I had learned about Alzheimer's disease to advise other companies in this space. And what I found is that the neurology field specifically has a lot of variability in their scales. There's a lot of day-to-day variability with the patients. The scales themselves are more subjective. It's very hard to measure well, and it's very easy to miss significance, miss true treatment effects when they really exist. And so in 2008, I started Pentara with my husband, and we built a company around measuring progression in neurodegenerative diseases, and particularly making sure you can see true treatment effects in these very noisy diseases. And it's ended up being Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, Duchenne, several other ataxias, any kind of rare degenerative diseases, or the more common degenerative diseases as well. And so we've now built to about 75 people, and we do data management, all the data cleaning, data standardization using the CDISC standards, and then analysis. And we have a really big group that also does study design and planning and statistical communications, because the communications around statistical concepts often need a light touch to make it accessible to a broad audience.
And I know that this is a very regulatory industry. So how do you manage that, and what exactly you do to safeguard the customer, safeguard the patient's data, and so on and so forth? What exactly you follow? What is that you the USP, probably your USP in terms of what you're doing, how you're doing things?
Yeah, so some of the requirements for regulated industry like this are a little bit different than things like HIPAA requirements. The HIPAA requirements involve specific access to patient data and knowing which patients they are. And in our case, most of the data we get is de-identified already. So we get information about the patients, but we don't know who they are. And so in that industry, it's much more critical to be able to trace the data from the source of entry all the way through to the analysis. And so we have a lot of regulatory requirements around that. We have, a lot of SOPs that we follow as a company. We have to go through internal audits and sometimes external audits to make sure all of that is lined up. And it all comes down to accountability from the day the data is collected through the analysis, and knowing every single step along that process, including full audit trails, and any edits need to be justified with reasons, dates, signatures, all that kind of thing. So there's quite a bit of overhead that relates to the FDA regulations. And we work with other regulatory groups too. And so there are also international standards. So we meet those international standards as well, but FDA standards cover a lot of the rest anyway, yeah.
And since you started this organization, so what exactly you saw as a change in terms of what you're doing, for instance, collecting the data or regulatory? So what are the significant changes that you saw since you started this operation or organization?
So one of the things that's really important, and I think a lot of people underestimate how important this is just the data standardization process itself. So the CDISC standards were implemented quite a while ago, but in 2018 is when the FDA said, okay, we're going to require CDISC SDTM data sets and ADA data sets. And requiring that standard was hard for a lot of companies, but we had been implementing CDISC standards since the early 2000s because it enables you so much. If you have all your data sets stored in the same way, you have the same variable names, you have the same data structures, the content of each variable is specified ahead of time, you know it can only be one of 5 possible responses. Having those standards applied early actually makes your whole process more efficient. And so a lot of companies, even to this day, still apply that standard at the end. And by applying it early, you get much more efficiency across everything. Your data comes in cleaner, your data stays cleaner, you're able to run macros and standard programs that you would otherwise have to customize every time. And so one of the things that we've been really strong advocates of is applying the standard strictly and early in the process, meaning as early as you can when the data is collected, having it as close as you can to the standard. Because you have to send it to the FDA in that standard.
Exactly.
You may as well apply it early. And I'm still surprised how many companies run the whole study and then at the very end convert to SDTM CDISC standards and ADAM data sets. We always implement as early as possible, and then we check the data monthly usually against the standard, and anything that's not fitting the standard gets sent back to ask questions at the sites. So the sites that run the clinical trial, they can answer those questions while it's ongoing, but if you wait and apply the standard later, you don't know what the answers to those questions are. And I think a lot of people would be surprised how many clinical medical decisions are being made by statisticians because they're standardizing the data at the end, and then they're having to make decisions without the patient in front of them. And it's not an accurate way to collect the data.
So now that you put all the scenarios in the beginning of the data collection, so I understand that you check every monthly. So that is going to change the narrative of the data collection and also reporting to FDA on a regular basis. My ask is, what difference does it make you doing it before and after? What significant changes are you getting doing what you're doing compared to your competitors or anybody else who's doing the same activities?
You know, what's been really interesting is that we've done a few studies that we've rescued from other contract research organizations. And when we've rescued those studies, what we find is that if the standard is applied late, and if it's applied kind of loosely and not very strictly, you often don't get the right answer. It just adds noise to your data. It makes it harder to see a true signal. And so we have several examples of this, but one that happened very recently where we went back to the source data, we applied the standard early, we implemented the standard, and then we reran their primary analyses. And their significance all got a little stronger. So they would have, say they have a trend, they have a p-value of 0.08 on their primary endpoint. We run that standard early on their data, we run it all the way through, and then that 0.08 turns into a 0.04. And of course, you know, less than 0.05 is where people declare significance. And so there are many times we found that a company has results that are just borderline, but if they had applied the standard early, they would have had a clean success. And that's always devastating in a way, because you think this treatment won't be able to get to people as soon because people don't realize it was a success. But if they had applied that standard early, they would have known. And when we do it after the fact, that's great. We know what the real answer is. But usually the FDA will say, okay, you need to go back and redo the study. You have to do a new study now to confirm that. If they had done it clean from the beginning, that might have been their pivotal trial. They might have been able to submit and get approval just with the one study.
Brilliant. And now that this data collection, data validation, and all those things is a very, human-driven, a lot of ifs and buts, manual errors and all those things. So how are you predicting those things? How are you managing the error pros from the human intervention? So what exactly you follow? Do you follow any AI models, ML models to segregate them based on the data that you receive? How does it work in your organization?
Right now, we're not using AI in this specific approach, but there are two places I think it could be really helpful early on. One is the data cleaning process, which is done by a data management group, and it's essentially going through and doing queries on the data. And that's something that an AI could do a really good job of. You know, if you give it some examples. So here are 10 studies where we've done data cleaning. Here's what it looked like before. Here's what it looked like after. Then it could go through and say, here's what probably needs cleaning in your new data. And that's an area I think is going to be really big in the next, 1 to 5 years in data management, is cleaning the data using AI techniques. The second place I think it could be really helpful is, I mentioned that we try to apply the CDISC SDTM standard at the point of data collection, but there are always conversions you need to do. You still need to change it to strictly meet the standard. And so if as soon as we get enough data, our plan is to try to implement that type of an approach using AI methods where we say, here are 10 different studies that we've done the full STTM conversion of. Here's the raw data that was collected. Here's the data we converted it to. Now have the AI do a first pass at what does that conversion look like for a new study. And I think it could probably get us, 90% of the way there, and then have someone else come through and add that last 10%.
I know you made it very clear that this is going to help you in terms of implementing AI and ML, but what are you looking forward from AI and ML? If you say, for instance, you implement this technology within next, say, for instance, 3 months or 6 months, what significant improvement do you see in the implementing the new technologies like AI and machine learning? From what you're doing to what you're going to be.
Yeah, so I think in the scenarios that we just talked about, that's going to mostly just make our timelines faster. We'll be able to get to the goal sooner. I don't think it's going to do a lot in terms of changing the quality, and I think we're still going to need oversight on it and having, real people checking the numbers and that kind of thing. There are a few places that I think AI can make a difference where it will actually make a big difference in the quality of the research we're doing. One of those places is digital endpoints. And a lot of the diseases that we're studying, they have people with these diseases have changes in their day-to-day life. And if you have a watch that they're wearing or a mobile phone that they're carrying in their pocket, or if you ask them to do specific tasks with their mobile phone, hold it out in front of you, hold it with 2 hands, hold it with 1 hand, that kind of thing. You can get data that is very rich in terms of how are these people moving differently, what's different about the way they're progressing, and those things can be tied to metrics of the disease that are measured in the clinic. And so I think digital biomarkers are a place where there could be a lot of really good use of AI technologies. Another thing that they sometimes do in these studies is have a camera in someone's house that will watch how fast they walk or how quickly they move from one place to another, and then measure whether their movements are getting slower or smoother. And if you're giving someone a treatment and you're able to measure this day-to-day life, you can potentially measure the impact in their day-to-day life. It can be things like cognition. Losing points on a cognitive scale correlates to walking slower in your house. There's a lot of things like that where AI could pick up subtle changes in the way people are moving, and that could be predictive of clinical changes. Now, it's a little tricky because, of course, with regulators as your ultimate audience, you can't just send them, numbers and say, hey, we measured some digital endpoints. This digital endpoint changed by 5 points. We think this is really meaningful. You have to connect it back to the clinical data and tell them this is actually relevant for these patients in their day-to-day life. And so we do a lot of work with optimizing outcome measures, and optimizing with digital outcomes is similar, but the databases are much bigger, the data sets are much larger, and so that's where I think AI is going to be a really big advantage.
And also, in the discussion you mentioned that there are a lot of fraudulent data that is being, you probably get a data from these clinical trial teams where they send you this data. So I understand that there's the challenges that you go through, but are you taking any steps to regulate that, or probably see some sort of action that you want to take over to reduce these errors or fraudulent data? What is your experience and how are you handling that?
Yeah, so we noticed these fraudulent sites that were in one of the studies that we were working on, and it was actually our client who knew that there were some issues, and they had one of their neurologists go to the site, and they had noticed some anomalies, and it was things that you wouldn't normally pick up very readily. But as they picked up those anomalies, they asked us, can you look at the data and see if there's anything going on at these sites that we think may be problematic compared to the sites that we think are clean? And the initial models that we ran were just traditional statistical models. I think sometimes people who get excited about AI forget that some of these problems have known solutions. We already have a closed form solution for the minimum variance unbiased estimate for these kinds of things. If there's a statistical solution, your data set isn't large, you don't need to be moving to AI. So what we did is we built a traditional model. We identified sites that were fraudulent. and we did it on the basis of the clinical trial data throughout the whole study. But then where the AI modeling came in is when we needed to have a model that could identify these patients before the study started. So at baseline, they're doing their screening assessment, they're doing their baseline assessment. We still fit traditional models there too, and we could get that to work. But there were some things that we were able to pick up a little more readily with an AI, where we just put all the variables in, and then we see at the time of enrollment in the trial, what's different about these patients. And we don't talk very much about what is different about the patients, because we don't want the people who are, committing the fraud to get better at getting around our algorithms. But we are now able to identify them on a per person basis at the beginning of the trial, instead of just once the trial is over on a site level. And that's a huge advantage, of course, because if you can stop them before they get in your trial, that's much better than trying to do something with them after your trial is over.
I know the regulators are very much into this kind of activity. So if you build any AI and machine learning or automation or robotics, so how do you think the FBI will react to it? When I say react to it, and what would be there? If your human being is doing something, they know that you have validated it. But if the machines are doing, if AI is doing, do you think the regulator will be very happy of your data and information that you're sharing with?
I think the question is whether we can still meet the same regulatory standards. So using AI to facilitate specific tasks, I don't think they'll be concerned with at all. I think if you're using AI to replace algorithms, or black box is really scary. If you send them something and say, we don't really know what the AI did, but here's what came out of it, they're not going to be excited about that at all. But what I find is that if you want to explore things using an AI and then dig into whatever you found using more traditional approaches, then you can explain to the FDA what's happening and be able to interpret it for them. And I think, when people start talking about AI taking over jobs, AI can take over the routine kinds of jobs, but the interpretation and explaining it to the FDA and, defining what it actually means clinically, what does this specific outcome mean clinically, and for a specific patient in front of a specific doctor, what does it mean when this score ends up higher or lower? Those interpretations and those communications are really going to need good quantitative people who can bridge the gap between the quantitative and the clinical. That's already one of the biggest things we do, honestly, is, I mentioned statistical communication, and it really is a big part of our job is making sure that what we learn from quantitative analysis of data sets can be explained to regulatory agencies, individuals at the regulatory agencies, also to clinicians who might be eventually using some of these treatments that we're studying. We need to be able to make whatever analyses we run very transparent to people, because no one wants to hear you say, just trust me. It's a complicated model, but it's doing the right things. No one wants to know that. They want to be able to look at the data in a figure, look at the numbers, and know why you're getting the result you're getting. So the AI can help you figure out where to focus, but you still have to be able to make it simplified enough that you can explain it to a broad audience.
Suzanne, do you have any other question that I think I missed out, or is there any topic that you want to say? Now that after this, I'm going to ask you a little bit of not relevant, but at the same time kind of a funny question, just to keep this momentum. So do you have anything you want to cover, any of those issue lines that I've missed out in the operations that you're doing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is a lot of people want to throw AI at everything, but a lot of these problems that we're trying to solve don't have data sets that are big enough to really support anything more than a traditional statistical solution. And if it's not big enough that you need it, then you don't really need to be applying it. And I think in those cases, it can be more of a distraction than a help, and it kind of gets in the way of getting the right answer. If you can just do it with traditional statistical methods, that's probably the best way to do it. One of the other things that we talk about quite a bit at Pentara is this idea. A lot of people will contract things out to India or to Eastern Europe, and they'll just get people who they just train to do these things, who don't have any degree in these things, and they just bring them in and say, hey, we're going to train you how to do this, and then you need to just do exactly what you're told on this data. And we found that anytime you can just get people that you can train how to do it, you could actually automate it yourself anyway. So we end up automating a lot of things at Pentara. Anything that we do routinely and regularly, if it's very predictable, we know exactly what needs to happen, we make it an automatic program. We make a macro out of it. We make a process out of it. And what happens, I think the place where this could be very helpful is if you have a complicated process, you don't know exactly all the variables that might impact it. You could do a traditional statistical approach. You could do some exploratory analyses. But if you have a big enough data set, looking for those patterns by hand is a lot harder than looking for them electronically. And that's where the AI can help. I do think one of the things that I've noticed is because AI is so good with large language models and with learning on written word, we think it's going to be just as good with quantitative. And quantitative is a lot harder because you have to translate it back to written words, but the way those models and things translate back is very complicated. And the assumptions that have to go into the modeling are also critical. And it's super easy to get overfit models and to get models that are based on assumptions where the assumptions aren't met at all. And some people are excited to program the AI to find the solution, but they forget to program it to also check the assumptions that went in.
Fair enough. Thank you, Susan, for covering that up. Other than, I know you're a very busy person running the organization, is not a small task. So how do you unwind? What exactly you do when you have a free time?
We have a CrossFit gym in the back, actually. So,
brilliant.
Yeah, so I own a CrossFit gym as well as the consulting company. And so half of our building, we have the front half is office space. It's 2 floors. The back is all one big floor and it has a big high ceiling. And we have classes throughout the day. We have people come in from the community. And so, I get down there for 1 hour every day and do my CrossFit workout. I like to tell people that I've been doing and hating CrossFit for 15 years now. And there is a part of hating it because it's always hard and you kind of dread it just a little bit, but the satisfaction of being done is worth it. And you do it with people you like, and if you're with people you like doing something you don't like, it's tolerable, and the results make it worth it, and so it's worth the extra effort. And my kids come in to do CrossFit with me too, and that's really fun when they come do it with me.
Brilliant. And do you read any books? Do you recommend any books for anybody who is trying to get into this kind of, I know that you are a CEO of the organization, you're quite a bit of knowledgeable in what you do, but as a young CEO who would like to get into this bandwagon of getting into entrepreneurship, what do you recommend? Do you have any recommendations?
I don't read a lot of books. Most of the work that I do, I read a lot of literature. So I read the scientific publications, and there's a lot of progress being made across all these different disease areas. And I find that if I read the current literature in any other degenerative disease, that I can learn a lot about how to apply things to my area. It's funny because my husband reads fiction and he loves reading, different fiction books, but I always read nonfiction when I read the book. And then more often I'll just read the literature of the field because I want to know everything that people are doing and make sure we're bringing in everything that we can from other disease areas where we could learn how we could do things better. So my reading is usually the literature of the field.
Then if you go back to your memory line when you were 16 years old, what were you thinking at the time? What were your dreams then?
If I go back to when?
When you go back to your 16, 14, 15 years of your age, what were you dreaming at that time? What was your dream then?
So it's interesting because when I was in high school, I wanted to go into medical research. And I was really good at math. And so I thought, well, I'll get an MD, but first I'll do an undergrad degree in something more mathematical. And so when I went to college, I did my undergrad. I started in physics, actually. And the plan was to go into to get an MD and then go into medical research. So I always wanted to go into medical research from the time I was really young, and I planned to get an MD. So I started on my bachelor's degree in physics, and then partway through, and physics was it was the idea of I'm good at math, I like math, but I want to apply it. I don't want to just do a straight math degree. But back then, statistics wasn't a very big field, and people didn't really know about it. So after a year of being in actually 2 years of being in the physics program, I found out about statistics. I took my first statistics class actually from my father, who's a quantitative psychologist. He didn't push me hard into it, but I took that class from him and I loved it. And so then I ended up becoming a statistics major. and I was still thinking I would go do an MD, but then I started working in clinical trials after my bachelor's and decided I wanted to just do clinical trials as a statistician. So then I went back to school in Boston and got my PhD in mathematics from Boston University. So I ended up kind of a circuitous route, but I ended up in the same field that I intended, which was medical research. And the goal there, of course, you know, I think almost everyone who goes into medical research, they want to help make the world a better place. You know, they want treatments for bad diseases. They want to help these people who have these terrible, terrible illnesses that almost always lead to death. They really want to make a difference in the world. That was always my motivation too, is to try to help people who otherwise would have a really, you know, difficult life and try to make their lives better.
What is still for next 5-10 years of, you know, what you're doing? So what is the plan? Are you want to exit from here, or you? What are you planning for the next 5 to 10 years? If you want to say.
Yeah, so we have companies approach us all the time about buying us. Whenever investors do research into what the most important areas are right now, or what areas are most up and coming, it's always technology and medicine. And so we're technology and we're medicine. And so we get at least one a week of a new company coming to us that says, hey, we're interested in buying your company. We're interested in investing in your company. And we're making so much progress on our own right now that I really worry that I wouldn't be able to keep it going the same direction I want to if someone else owned the company. So I really like the autonomy of being able to build it the direction I want. And the people we've hired are all so smart that I feel like I'm just working with a super great team. We're having a lot of fun. We're learning a lot in the process. We're making a difference in the world. We've done several submissions to the FDA. We've had approvals of drugs. Someday, maybe, you know, we would partner with someone, or we would, you know, decide to sell part of the company. But we're also automating so much that things that used to take us a week to turn around, we can turn them around in 1 or 2 days now. And so we're just trying to be smarter about how we're doing it. And I feel like with the 75 people we have, we're probably doing the work of 300 people just because of the automation. I feel like there's still quite a bit of room for growth there and quite a bit of room to move into other areas. If I were saying what my biggest goals are over the next 5 to 10 years, the FDA tends to be pretty traditional. And more recently, it sounds like maybe there might be some openings where they would be more progressive around some things. But there are a lot of treatments right now in degenerative diseases that work, and the FDA isn't able to approve them because they have a specific checklist, and if they don't meet the checklist, they can't approve it. And so we do a lot in trying to publish research that shows that treatments can work without checking the traditional boxes. And what we find, actually, I think people are very familiar with this concept of treating a disease when it's really bad versus preventing it before it gets bad, right? So there's a movement toward trying to prevent diseases instead of waiting until they're really bad and treating them. But the system is all geared toward treating the bad stage of the disease, and all the big costs are in the late stage. And so people kind of wait too long. What we find is in the degenerative disease space, people are doing the same thing, which is that all the check boxes that are set up for regulators are looking for big dramatic changes, and you only get these big dramatic effects in late stage disease. So we're helping them see the value of small changes in early disease where you're actually slowing down the time until you get the disease, or say you slow it down by 50%, you can push the time that you get the disease by double. So say you're 5 years before an Alzheimer's diagnosis. If you start treating someone and it slows it down by 50%, then it'll be 10 years until you're diagnosed. But the treatment effects you're seeing are very small in terms of the points because the disease isn't even progressing very fast. So our very biggest agenda is to get the FDA to acknowledge and value those early subtle changes that result.